Welcome back to the show, MetFLex and Chill. This is your host, Rachel Gregory, and today I have another solo episode for you. So today I'm going to be answering a bunch of questions that I got on Instagram. And before I dive in, I just want to let you know that anything that I mention in this episode in terms of links to different blog posts or previous episodes, I will be linking those in the show notes. So again, if you are listening to this on iTunes, all you have to do is swipe up while you're listening to the episode and you'll see all the show notes there and all the links to anything I talk about. If you're listening to this on Spotify or Stitcher, I believe that you just have to press the read more button and you'll be able to view all of those show notes. So yep, that's how you do that. And let's get right into the questions. Okay, so the first question is, can you talk about glucose tracking for weight loss and why is it important? So this is a great question. I actually wrote a blog post on this topic in this series that I wrote about why all calories are not created equal. So this particular blog post is called The Blood Sugar Roller Coaster. I'll link it in the show notes so you can check it out. But before I dive into this question, I just want to chat real quick about how to actually track your blood glucose or blood sugar levels and kind of the most common devices. So the most common way to track blood glucose is by using a blood glucose monitor. These are fairly cheap. It's just a finger prick and you insert the blood into the monitor and it reads the number within a few seconds. These you can find on Amazon or Rite Aid or CVS, any of your local drugstores. So that's the most common and the cheapest way to measure blood glucose levels. There's also something called a continuous blood glucose monitor, which I've experimented with a little bit myself, which I'll talk about in a second. So the most common times to track your blood sugar levels are fasted in the morning and then also around your meals. So I'm going to talk more about tracking around meals in this particular episode as it relates to this question. But just in general, for fasting glucose, the American Diabetes Association actually considers normal fasting glucose to be below 100 milligrams per deciliter. But there is some recent research that indicates that optimal fasting blood glucose is likely somewhere below 85 milligrams per deciliter. So this just gives you some numbers to kind of be aware of. Obviously, everyone is different, but in general, higher fasting blood glucose levels tend to be associated with more health-related issues. So again, I'm not going to dive too much into fasting blood glucose here, but I do want to talk about measuring blood glucose levels or blood sugar levels around your meals. So basically, to do that, you measure your blood sugar prior to eating a food or meal, and then you record that number just so you know what your baseline is. You eat that food or meal, and then you test postprandial levels. So postprandial, if you've ever heard that term, it just means post-meal. So usually, everybody's different, but usually to test your levels, you'll test baseline, like I mentioned. Before you eat, you'll eat your meal, and then you'll test 30 minutes, 60 minutes, and sometimes even people test 30, 60, 90, and 120 minutes. That's a little bit excessive, but at least 30 minutes, I would say, and 90 minutes is probably the ones that I do, but anywhere up to 2 hours. And the reason you're doing this is because you want to basically see how your blood sugar levels respond within that 2-hour period after you eat that specific food or meal. So ideally, you don't want to see a big spike or crash throughout this time, and you want to see that blood sugar or blood glucose level come back down to baseline within a 2-hour period or sooner post-meal. So that's kind of how you measure postprandial blood glucose levels. And then again, as I mentioned, continuous glucose monitors, they're not as popular as the blood glucose monitors because they're a lot more expensive, and anybody who doesn't have any type of ailment or diabetes usually can't get a continuous glucose monitor. Traditionally, you have to have a prescription to get one, but as of recently, there's more and more coming out on the market and the price is starting to come down a little bit. So I've actually tested some experiments using continuous glucose monitors in the past. I have some of those on my Instagram page if you want to check out some of my I believe I have some posts up there. I'm going to do some more testing I actually have one. I have a continuous glucose monitor in my closet right now. But it's basically a monitor that you put on and it lasts for 14 days and it syncs up with an app on your phone. So you can just like swipe your phone against your arm where the monitor is and it tells you exactly what your blood glucose levels are at that time that you swipe it. So it's really cool. You don't have to do any type of you don't have to do finger pricks or anything like that. So I think the continuous glucose monitors are really, really cool in terms of getting like continuous data across the day. And so I loved experimenting with it and seeing, what different foods and different meals, how they affected my blood sugar, blood glucose levels. So yeah, I can talk more about that in a future episode, and any experiments that I do, I will definitely talk about that. But those are the two ways to measure your blood glucose levels. Again, the blood glucose monitor is the cheaper way and probably the more common way, but the continuous glucose monitor is probably actually a better way because you can, again, get a continuous number and you can test it throughout the day. You don't have to do finger pricks and stuff like that all day long. So yeah, I would go with the continuous if you can. Again, this is just to get some data and to see kind of how your body reacts to the different foods that you eat. So it can tell you some cool stuff. So to get back to the question, the main reason that you can use glucose tracking to help with weight loss or fat loss is what we like to refer to it as, fat loss over weight loss, is because of this blood sugar roller coaster that I mentioned. So when you eat a food that spikes your blood sugar fast, it tends to lead to a crash, within that 2-hour period, sometimes sooner, sometimes later. It depends on the person, obviously. But when that happens, you're generally more likely to get more cravings and more increased hunger because your body is naturally just not going to like that crash. Like your body wants to stay at homeostasis, which is just kind of leveled out, right? So if it senses some crash in your blood sugar, it's going to do whatever it can to bring that blood sugar back up to normal, right? And one of the most common things it does is basically causes you to crave more sugar and more food to bring that level back up. So this is probably the main reason why you want to stay away from, processed and higher carb foods. And also just in general, avoiding eating naked carbs or eating carbs without any protein or fat with them. And the reason for this is because carbs immediately turn into glucose, right? Or blood sugar. Blood glucose and blood sugar are the same thing. When you eat carbs, it turns into sugar in your body, no matter what type of carb it is. Obviously, the amount of time it takes to turn into sugar or cause any spikes or crashes depends on the type of carb, of course. And again, I'm not saying this is me not saying that carbs are bad, right? We already know that, especially if you've listened to this podcast, we dive into why you shouldn't be afraid of carbs, especially if they're a whole food carb like sweet potatoes or fruit or things like that. But this is something that we have to be aware of. So basically, if you can track how you react to certain foods using blood glucose monitoring, you can help prevent that blood sugar spike and crash from happening. And you just become more aware of the foods that might cause this for you, or just become more aware of how your body reacts to certain amounts of carbs as well. So that's the main reason for tracking blood sugar levels around your meal. So you can see how your body responds to these different food sources, right? So that's the main thing. And then another reason is related to the hormone insulin. And so foods that are high in sugar and carbs, processed, refined, made in factories, usually they're digested and absorbed super quickly because they are highly refined and are high in sugar. And this can lead to rapid spikes and dips in blood sugar levels and insulin levels. So insulin is the hormone released from your pancreas whenever blood sugar rises. And insulin is basically what shuttles that glucose or blood sugar or energy into your cells. Something that is, really misinterpreted a lot in the low carb and keto space, especially those who are newer to low carb keto, is that insulin itself is not the bad guy, right? Like we need insulin to live. A lot of people kind of hear about insulin, they hear that it's the fat storage hormone, and I've referred to it as that before too, but I would say that it's not something that is bad, right? We need insulin to live. That's why diabetes is what it is. People become resistant to insulin, or if you're type 1 diabetic, you cannot produce enough insulin to keep up with your body, basically. So we need insulin to live. The issue that we're seeing in our modern world and our modern society that has contributed to the rise in obesity and other diseases is something called insulin resistance. So here's a quick stat for you. This is something that this number has probably risen. I got this stat when I wrote my book. I guess it's a year ago. So this number's probably risen since then, but it's estimated that over 32% of the US population has insulin resistance. And what's even scarier is that many people with insulin resistance are unaware that they have it until they actually develop prediabetes or diabetes or other serious conditions. So really the bottom line is we want to make sure that our bodies are not on this path of becoming insulin resistant and rather working towards becoming more insulin sensitive, which is a process that really occurs when we don't rely on carbohydrates as our main fuel source at all times. Again, it's not that carbohydrates are bad, it's just that we don't want to rely on them, as the main fuel source because of issues like this. So this is a reason why I'm such an advocate of becoming more metabolically flexible and working towards becoming more metabolically flexible so that you don't have to rely on carbs 24/7, right? Because that can lead to issues like insulin resistance, and we know that it's something that's on the rise in modern society. So how do you prevent or improve this insulin resistance? You want to become more insulin sensitive, which is the opposite, obviously. So how do you do that? Well, it depends on the person. It depends on the degree to which your insulin sensitivity improves and remains long-term, dependent on you as an individual. So factors such as physical activity and just your general metabolic health, particularly the duration that you were previously insulin resistant, play a role in your level of carbohydrate tolerance and your degree of metabolic flexibility, right? So the more metabolically flexible you are, usually the more stable your blood sugar levels are and the more insulin sensitive you are. So to me, that's kind of the end goal. You want to become as insulin sensitive as possible so that your body can deal with and process carbs and not feel those spikes and crashes in your blood sugar levels throughout the day. And this all comes back to becoming more metabolically flexible, which is what we talk about in the show, MetFLex and Chill. So to dive a little bit more into metabolic flexibility, again, if you haven't taken my free MetFLex Life course, I'll link it in the show notes. I take you through exactly what metabolic flexibility is, how and why you should strive to become more metabolically flexible. And I talk a little bit about insulin and blood sugar roller coasters and all of that stuff in this course. So definitely check that out. To get back to the original question, why is it important to measure blood glucose levels for tracking fat loss or weight loss? Why is that important? It's not something that you have to do. Like, you don't have to do that to lose fat or weight, but it will give you good insights into how your body reacts to certain foods that you're eating. So again, I will link the blog post that I wrote on the blood sugar roller coaster in the show notes, so you can check that out in more detail. But really the main goal you would use that is to just see how your body reacts and try to improve your response to certain foods and see how your blood sugar responds to that. So if you notice that you eat a certain food and your blood sugar spikes and crashes kind of really high or really low, then you probably have to address that issue, and you probably are getting more cravings and hunger after that than you would if you either ate that specific food with other foods, or you ate less of that food, or maybe your body just doesn't respond well to that food, or you just need to work on becoming more insulin sensitive and more metabolically flexible, which again, I chat all about in that free MetFLex Life course. So definitely check that out in the show notes. Okay, so the next question is, can you touch on women's cycles? Could keto make them longer? Okay, so I actually chatted a lot about this particular subject in the 2 episodes I did with Dr. Jamie Seeman and Allie Miller. So I'm going to link both of those episodes in the show notes, especially the one with Dr. Jamie Seeman. She is a OBGYN, and we go through everything in that episode related to all things women's health and cycles, and she dives deep into that. So definitely check out that episode. Again, I'll link it in the show notes. But it's so individualized depending on the person, right? Because everybody's different. I talk about this all the time. For some people, it really comes down to any drastic change you make to your diet, your exercise, your lifestyle. Any drastic change can alter your cycle. It can make it longer, shorter, irregular. So some women may notice that if they go strict keto, and also at the same time drastically reduce calorie intake, they start to get irregularities in their cycle. That's something that I've seen a lot. I actually had that for myself years ago, and it's just I think for that, it's mainly because of the caloric reduction. And this also comes back to how the body responds to different stressors, especially in women. And again, I chat about all of this in the episode with Allie Miller. We talk all about stress and allostatic load and why you have to be so aware of that and how that can affect your cycle length and irregularity and all of that. So again, definitely check out that episode. But my best advice to help re-regulate your cycle is to start with managing your stress load or your allostatic load, which is just all of the different stressors in your life. So diet, exercise, lifestyle, everything. Allostatic load is just basically your overall stress load. If you can start to manage that and start to do things to help decrease your stress load, that can help a lot with bringing your cycle back to normal as well. Also sleeping and just overall stress management. And then also the next tip I would give is to also just be consistent with your diet over a period of time. So if you're noticing irregular cycles, you might be switching things up too often. So you may just need to be more consistent for a few months. Stick to the same thing. Don't continue to experiment week to week to week, because again, your body wants to maintain homeostasis, right? That's just its natural state. It will do anything to maintain that state. And if you continuously switch things up and you're trying new things, sometimes that can cause your body to be like, okay, hold up, what are you doing? I don't understand. So I'm going to prioritize survival and put reproduction or put my cycle on hold or whatever it may be. So it might just come back to being more consistent with your diet over a period of time. And I'm talking about keep it consistent for a few months and see if that helps with bring your cycle back to normal. So that's another tip that I would say. And then lastly, if you've heard of seed cycling, this is something that I've personally used myself and noticed some, I haven't used it for a while, but I did use it for a consistent amount of time. I think it was a year and a half ago. I was having a little bit of irregularities in my cycle, and I did consistent seed cycling, and I noticed and my cycle actually started to regulate again. So this is something that there's not that much research on this, but there is anecdotal evidence and research. So I actually recorded 2 YouTube videos back when I did this. So I guess it was a year and a half ago. I recorded 2 YouTube videos talking about seed cycling. So I'll link those in the show notes for you to check out. I actually did them for seed cycling recipes. So there's 2 parts to seed cycling. I'm not going to dive into all of it now, but you can check that out on my YouTube channel. Again, I'll link them both in the show notes. That might be something that you want to try out. Again, this is something that you can't just do it for a week and expect something to happen. You have to do it for several cycles, so for several months to really see if it is something that would help you. So those would be kind of my tips or suggestions related to maybe if you are having irregular cycles. Again, go check out those 2 episodes with Dr. Jamie Seeman and Allie Miller. We dive into this subject in a lot more detail. Okay, the next question, keto and breastfeeding tips. Okay, so again, this is a subject that I talk about, or that Dr. Jamie Seeman talks about in the episode we did. So I'm going to link it again in the show notes so you can check that out. She's, again, an OBGYN, and we talk all about keto and pregnancy and breastfeeding. But a few tips that I did pick up from her and some other sources is the main thing when it comes to keto and breastfeeding, or just changing your diet in general and breastfeeding. The main thing is the importance of having adequate calories or adequate energy, right? You want to avoid any sudden decrease in caloric intake if you are breastfeeding, because this can cause your body to be like, whoa, what's happening? Like, you're decreasing your calories. I'm not getting enough fuel. I'm going to, stop my milk supply or reduce my milk supply. And that's obviously not a good thing if you're breastfeeding. So that's the biggest thing. The biggest thing is making sure that you're getting enough calories, enough energy, quality nutrients. That's the biggest thing. So you need to keep an eye on your caloric intake no matter what type of diet you're following. And if you're trying out keto, whatever it may be. The next thing is you want to make sure you're getting enough protein. So protein, you probably all know if you've listened to me chat before on this podcast, I'm all about protein. Protein is super, super important. So you need to be getting enough protein. And then also you don't necessarily, and I wouldn't recommend doing this. Like I personally don't think that if you've never experienced being in a state of ketosis before, that doing it right after you have a baby it's probably not a good idea, just because any drastic change to your diet is going to cause your body to be like, whoa, what's happening? And it could cause negative side effects, right? So it doesn't matter if you're going keto or trying vegan or any other type of quote unquote diet, any drastic change you make is going to affect how your body reacts, right? So I would recommend, maybe if you've never done keto before, if you've never been in a state of ketosis before, probably you don't want to do that right away as the new thing after you have a baby and you're breastfeeding. So I would say if you want to try it out, if you want to go lower carb, probably start by gradually decreasing your carbs and seeing how your body responds. Again, still maintaining adequate caloric intake, adequate energy, adequate protein. That's going to be super important. And then also water and electrolytes. So, I think that on anybody following any type of diet needs to be getting enough water and electrolytes. That's super important. Hydration and enough electrolytes is important for anybody, but especially if you are breastfeeding as well, because you want to keep that hydration up. And then another tip is also just waiting until the baby is at least 2 months old before you start any type of diet. Again, this comes back to that calorie intake or that fuel that you're consuming. You want to have enough fuel to be able to produce enough and nutrient-dense breast milk, right? So going on a diet right after having a baby might not be the best idea, because you might notice that your milk supply diminishes or things like that. So usually waiting until after the baby starts solids, which is, I don't have a baby, I'm not an expert in this, but this is just the research that I've done. Usually like 6+ months is probably even better to wait till then to start any type of diet. Again, Dr. Jamie talks about this in the episode that we did, and we dive more into pregnancy and caloric intake and all of that. So definitely check out that episode. I will link it in the show notes, but hopefully you got a few tips there. All right, last question. What is one thing you've learned about yourself in quarantine that surprises you? Okay, so this is a hard question. I was thinking about this for a little bit. I think the biggest thing is, for me, I feel like quarantine is my normal life mostly, because I obviously work from home, so I'm not used to, getting up and going to work every day. But the one thing that I do miss, of course, is the gym. And something that surprised me for a while is that, I thought when this started, like I bought some adjustable dumbbells, I have some resistance bands, I have all the stuff I need to still progress in my workouts. And I talked about this a little bit in previous episodes. But the biggest thing I realized is that there's such a big piece of just going to the gym And even if I just go there and I have my headphones in and I'm not even talking to anybody, just being around people and being in that social environment is its own like motivational factor in itself. And I talked about this a little bit, but it's just like working out from home is just so much different. And I used to be jealous of people who had like garage gyms and stuff like that, because I was like, oh, that'd be awesome. Like I can get a squat rack and, you know, have my own gym. But I'm not nothing against that. Like if you have that and, you know, you like all the power to you, and jealous of you right now if you have that. But just in general, like I noticed that I am just not as excited to work out because I don't know, I don't have that, just having the people around me and being in that social environment, even if I'm not talking to anybody, it's like, it's just different. So I guess that's kind of, I guess that's not really something that I've learned about myself, but it's something that I've learned about my routine, and that I probably, even if I do get a house down the line, probably won't be installing a home gym anytime soon unless we face another pandemic, but hopefully that doesn't happen. Anyways, I guess that would be the main thing that I've learned. But again, it's hard because I feel like quarantine is like my normal life minus going to the gym for a few hours out of the day and then like going out to dinner on weekends and maybe socializing a little bit more. But yeah, that's my answer to that question. So that's all we have for today. Again, if you haven't checked out that free MetFLex life course, I linked it in the show notes. Talks all about metabolic flexibility. If you're new to the show, or if you just want to learn more about it, you can sign up and go through that. And then also, if you are looking for recipes or more information, more details into some of the topics we talked about today, on my website, I will link that in the show notes as well. And I have a bunch of blog posts, videos, tons of other resources, ebooks, things like that. So definitely check that out. All right, I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I look forward to answering more questions next week. I'll see you then.